The wind hit like a freight train, dry and coarse, carrying a wall of sand that turned the horizon into a blur of rust-colored doom. Cadet Yillex's voice cracked over the comms, visibility approaching zero. This storm was not forecasted. From inside the thin-walled observation pod, the alien cadets scrambled like appended beetles. The station had been set up as a temporary research outpost on Arkanis 3, a desert moon with a notoriously volatile climate. The Galactic Academy had sent a team of 6 cadets on a month-long survival and observation mission, and for 5 days, things had gone relatively smooth. Then the sandstorm came early. Cadet Feshna slipped as she tried to secure the hatch, her blue fingers fumbling with the locking mechanism. "I can't seal it, it's jammed. Why didn't we get a warning?" Yillex hissed, shielding his 3 eyes from the swirling grit already seeping in. The pod trembled as the wind howled louder, lifting loose gear and slamming it against the walls. "This is a Class 7 storm, Class 7, Feshna's voice rose an octave. "This structure isn't rated beyond 5, the air grew thicker with dust, sifting through crevices, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. The temperature dropped sharply. Yillex stumbled back from the window, his skin turning dull under the UV filter panel. "We have to evacuate. To where?" Feshna clutched the emergency beacon but hesitated. "The transport's 3 kilometers out and we can't navigate in this." That's when the door burst open. A tall figure pushed through the storm like a ghost made of canvas and tubing. He was wrapped head to toe in a makeshift cloak stitched from solar blankets and tent fabric, his face hidden behind polarized goggles and a scarf soaked in water. "Everyone okay in here?" he shouted over the wind. Yillex blinked. What are you?" The figure pulled down his scarf. "Name's Wyatt Granger. You folks look like you're having a bad day." Feshna stared. "You're the human." "The one from the terraforming survey crew?" "Used to be," Wyatt said, yanking the hatch shut behind him and jamming a metal rod through the latch to keep it from buckling. "Got reassigned to this moon after the budget cuts. Been camping about a kilometer north. Saw the storm on my sensors. You walked here, through that." Yillex's voice cracked. "I jogged part of it," Wyatt said, pulling off his goggles. His face was red and scratched, but his eyes were sharp. "Figured you might need a hand." The pod jolted again. One of the support beams creaked ominously. "This place isn't going to hold," Wyatt muttered, scanning the interior. "You've got maybe an hour before the wind peels it open like a tin can." Feshna looked at him, eyes wide. "We don't have transport. We're supposed to wait for orbital pickup in 3 days. "Well," Wyatt said, "then we better build something that'll last 3 days. Yillex stepped forward. "Build out of what?" "The junk you've got lying around. Wind's strong enough to kill us, but it's also strong enough to help us." "Come on." He didn't wait for agreement. Wyatt marched to the crate of survey equipment and started yanking out parts, tripod frames, solar panel mounts, anything that looked rigid and light. "We don't know how to build shelters," Feshna said, following him numbly. "Good thing I do," Wyatt muttered, tossing a collapsed turbine frame to the side. "Now grab every tension cable and all the solar fabric you've got. We're turning this storm into a generator." In the next hour, chaos became motion. Wyatt directed the cadets with the precision of a field engineer. He explained nothing twice, but made sure they understood every instruction. "Dig anchor holes here, not there. Winds coming from the southeast. No, that pole won't hold unless you brace it with this. See? Like this." He used the storm's own pressure to tension the fabric, angling the shelter like an aircraft wing so the wind would press it down instead of ripping it up. Instead of fighting the storm, he used it. By dusk, their skin raw and eyes burning, the cadets stood beside a strange angular structure shaped like a bent claw. It groaned with every gust, but held firm. Inside, the temperature stabilized. The walls hummed faintly with the whine of turbine blades spinning at the apex. Feshna collapsed onto the floor. "It's warm in here." "Wind-powered heating," Wyatt said, double-checking the turbine connections. "Took a page from old Earth tech. You'd be amazed what humans used to build with nothing but canvas and wind." Yillex stared at him. "You did this in 1 day," Wyatt shrugged. "Had some practice. Grew up in New Mexico. We used to get dust storms like this every summer." The alien cadets looked at one another, then back at him. You're not terrified. Oh, I'm terrified, Wyatt said, pulling off his jacket and revealing a bloodied scrape down his arm. I just don't have time to think about it. Feshna went quiet. She hadn't even noticed the injury. You're hurt. Yeah, he sat down carefully. Caught a metal shard when I was rigging the top brace. Hurts like hell. You need medical attention. I'll live. Just need to clean it, keep it wrapped. The cadets watched him silently as he pulled out a small medkit and began treating the wound. They didn't speak until he'd finished. You didn't have to come, Yillex said. I know. Why did you? Wyatt didn't respond right away. He looked at the walls of the shelter, the way the fabric rippled but didn't tear, how the turbine blades hummed steadily. Then he said, because I saw people in trouble and I figured I could help. That's all. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the wind-powered shelter stood firm, humming quietly like a heartbeat. The storm hadn't let up, but it had shifted. The walls of the shelter vibrated differently now, lower pitch, longer intervals. Wyatt pressed the back of his hand against the taut fabric, still holding. No sag in the seams. He exhaled, then leaned back onto the crate he'd dragged in as a seat. Feshna was crouched across from him, her lower arms wrapped around her knees in a posture that, Wyatt had gathered, meant cautious observation. Yillex was fiddling with a thermal sensor nearby, tapping it like the screen personally offended him. All right, Wyatt said, digging into a pouch on his belt. Who's got drinking water? Feshna tilted her head. We've rationed half a liter per cadet for the day cycle. Emergency protocol. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. You're still following academy rations in a sandstorm. Yes, she answered like it was a trick question. He pulled out a collapsible kettle and a small metal mesh bundle. Well, I'm making tea. Yillex looked up. Tea? Yes, you boil water, add plants, let it sit, then drink it. That's inefficient. Wyatt opened the kettle and poured in a measured amount from his own flask. Welcome to humanity. Feshna narrowed her eyes. But that's your emergency water. I know. He lit a small burner and set the kettle on top. The soft hiss of ignition was barely audible over the wind outside. You're wasting hydration for a flavor experience, Yillex asked. It's not about flavor, Wyatt muttered. It's about morale, Feshna stared. Are you trying to emotionally stabilize us? With leaves? Yep. Yillex opened his mouth, then closed it again. Minutes passed. The shelter creaked and swayed, but never faltered. The kettle rattled gently as it heated. Wyatt leaned forward, peeling back the bandage on his arm. The gash was deeper than he'd expected. The antiseptic had held, but the edges were starting to swell. He wiped it down again with a fresh alcohol pad and applied a butterfly closure over the worst part. Feshna watched. That wound should have been closed with Dermabond. I'm not carrying Dermabond, Wyatt said. I've got gauze, tape, and stubbornness. Stubbornness isn't a medical adhesive. Works surprisingly well when you don't have a med bay. Yillex stepped closer. You're not treating for infection. I cleaned it twice, wrapped it clean. That'll hold for a day. If I start seeing streaks or fever, then we've got a problem. But for now, this is triage. Feshna tilted her head again. You memorized all this? Nope, learned it the hard way. Yillex crouched beside him. How many times have you been injured in field conditions? Wyatt gave him a flat look. You ever try setting up a weather station in the middle of a cyclone season on a subtropical mining moon? Tools break, rations run out, wildlife gets creative. Feshna pointed subtly at his arm. Did you lose anyone? He didn't answer right away. The kettle began to whistle softly, giving him an excuse to stand. He poured the hot water into 3 mugs fashioned from cut-down sample containers, dropping a pinch of dried herbs into each. The scent that rose was earthy, strange, and soothing in a way that didn't make sense. Finally, Wyatt said, yeah, once. A guy named Terk, he thought he could outrun a groundquake. Feshna accepted the tea without further comment. They drank in silence for a while. The wind outside had shifted again, less erratic, more rhythmic. Wyatt glanced at the turbine readout. The blades were spinning faster, but the voltage regulator was holding. No signs of overload. Yillex tapped his mug thoughtfully. This is not terrible. You're welcome, Wyatt said. Feshna sniffed her cup. It smells like boiled fungus. That's chamomile, she sipped again. It tastes like boiled fungus. Still better than sand, Wyatt said. The wind howled louder, then abruptly dropped. Not stopped, just lessened. The pressure change was abrupt enough to make Yillex flinch. Feshna stood. That's not a natural taper. Agreed, Wyatt said. He moved to the turbine panel and checked the pressure sensor. Winds shifting east. That shouldn't happen until the back end of the front. Yillex stared at the readout. You think something altered the pattern? Could be terrain, could be artificial. Could be the atmosphere doing whatever it wants because this moon hates us. Feshna moved to the comms panel. I'll try hailing the transport again. Wyatt shook his head. Not yet. Wait until the wind drops below sustained 70. Otherwise, you're just broadcasting static. She hesitated. So we do nothing. We monitor. That's doing something. Yillex turned back to Wyatt. You're unusually calm for someone who might be stranded indefinitely. I prefer the term temporarily unrescued. Feshna glanced at the shelter walls. If they don't reach us, how long can this structure last? 3 days, easy. 4 if we conserve. 5 if we get creative. Yillex blinked. What does creative entail? Depends what breaks first. They all went quiet again. The wind rose and fell in long pulses. Wyatt leaned back against the crate, closing his eyes for a moment. Then Feshna said, You're not like the other humans we've studied. Wyatt opened one eye. Not sure that's a compliment. You're more chaotic. Still not sure, but efficient, better. Yillex leaned forward. Do most humans think like you? In emergencies, Wyatt scratched his chin. We're not a monolith, but when things go sideways, most of us get real creative real fast. Panic's a luxury we can't afford. Feshna looked thoughtful. So you overwrite fear with function, pretty much. You get scared later when it's safe. Yillex tapped his mug. That is a disturbingly practical approach. Well, it beats the alternative. Later, when the storm dipped into manageable levels, Wyatt climbed onto the roof to adjust the turbine intake. The wind nearly knocked him sideways, but he anchored himself with a harness and worked quickly. Every bolt he turned, every flap he realigned bought them more time back inside. Feshna watched him through the viewport. He's not suited for this environment, she said. He adapts anyway, Yillex replied. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped again, but the shelter remained stable. The thermal fabric retained heat better than expected, and Wyatt had managed to route some of the turbine output into a converted heat coil. As they prepared to rest, Feshna sat cross-legged near the center, sketching diagrams into her datapad. Wyatt rolled out his sleeping mat. Homework? Redesigning the temporary shelter module. Yours is better. Yillex looked up from a diagnostic readout. You're submitting human designs to the Academy. No, Feshna said. I'm submitting functional designs. They just happen to be invented by a human. Wyatt chuckled. Glad to contribute to interstellar engineering. Yillex added, assuming we survive long enough to submit anything. Wyatt laid down and closed his eyes. We will. The storm's got maybe another day in it. After that, if your transport doesn't show, I'll walk you to my camp. Feshna frowned. That's too far under exposure conditions. Not if we build a sled and rig the turbine as propulsion. Yillex blinked. You want to build a wind-powered vehicle. Wyatt yawned. Why not? Already built a house. Might as well add a garage. Sleep came slowly, but it came. The storm outside shrieked and clawed, but the shelter stood unmoved. Inside, 3 species shared warmth, silence, and the faint scent of boiled fungus. By the second morning, the wind had dropped low enough to hear your own thoughts again. The shelter creaked now and then, but the harmonic vibration of the turbine had faded into a comforting background hum, like a distant engine idling on an empty road. Wyatt had woken before the others. He'd pulled on his thermal liner, checked the turbine's load readings, and then started boiling water again, this time for sterilization. The wound on his arm had changed overnight. It wasn't worse, not exactly, but it didn't look like something the body was handling on its own. He peeled off the bandage and tilted the portable mirror toward the gash. No spreading redness, but the tissue around the cut was puffier than it should be. He'd cleaned it thoroughly, but sand found its way into everything out here, and he couldn't rule out debris still buried inside. He leaned closer, flexing his arm slowly, watching the muscle under the skin pull at the scabbed edges. Still alive, he muttered to himself, then poured boiling water into a sterilized tray and set out the few implements he had left tweezers. an irrigation syringe, and a small packet of alcohol swabs that were technically expired, but he wasn't in a position to care. Feshna stirred behind him, her antennae twitching as she sat up. "You're doing field surgery on yourself, not surgery," he said, dipping the tweezers into the sterilized tray. "Just cleaning." "Again, why not let us assist? Because unless one of you took a semester of backwoods medicine, you'd mostly be guessing," Yillex groaned from the corner. "I can recite your muscle group names in 3 languages. That's great, but unless you can pull a splinter out of inflamed soft tissue without making it worse, I'm gonna stick with my own hands." Feshna got up and crouched beside him. "Do you know what you're looking for? Something that isn't me." He pulled the scarf from his supply roll and bit down on it. "This part's not gonna be fun." He irrigated the wound with the warm water, loosening the crusted buildup. The sting wasn't surprising, but it still made his eyes water. He pressed the tweezers in gently, working under the irritated edge until something shifted. A sliver of metal less than half an inch long slid free. Feshna leaned closer. "That was in your arm the whole time, apparently." Wyatt spat the scarf out, exhaling hard. "Explains the throbbing." Yillex was standing now, watching from a safe distance. "And now I disinfect again, then I close it." "With what?" Wyatt held up a needle and a small coil of fishing line. Feshna tilted her head. "You're going to stitch your own arm." "Yeah." "Done it before." He threaded the needle slowly, his fingers steady despite the pain. "You want to watch or pass me that antiseptic?" She handed it over without a word. The suturing took time. Each pass of the needle brought a fresh jolt of discomfort, but Wyatt worked methodically, tying each knot with practiced efficiency. When he was done, he rinsed the area one last time, then wrapped it in a fresh bandage. Yillex broke the silence first. "That was disturbingly competent." "I'll take it as a compliment." Feshna was still focused on the extracted shard. "You didn't hesitate. If I did, I wouldn't have finished." She set the metal sliver down on the supply crate. "You should have gone into medicine." "I tried." "Failed organic chemistry, twice." Yillex blinked. "So you pursued hazardous fieldwork instead." Plan B had fewer prerequisites. Later that afternoon, after a hearty meal of rehydrated lentils and compressed protein bars, Yillex ran another atmospheric scan. The storm had moved further east, losing force. Readings showed moderate particulate density, but no longer anything that would rip open a pressure seal. Feshna set down a sensor module. "We can make the hike to your camp now if necessary." Wyatt leaned against the support beam, sipping from his cup. "We could, but we won't. The shelter's stable, and you've got breathable air, power, and insulation. No point risking exposure unless it's urgent." Yillex hesitated. "What if the storm damaged our camp's signal relay? Then we wait for the next orbital pass. Worst case, I've got a transmitter at my camp that still works off the old solar array, but we'd have to drag half our gear there uphill in soft sand." Feshna tapped her datapad. "We could fabricate a sled." "We could," Wyatt said, "but it'd take the rest of the day, and we'd need to dismantle part of the turbine rig to do it. I'd rather keep what's working intact until we know it's necessary." She nodded without argument. By evening, the wind had died to a steady breeze. The turbine spun slower now, but still produced enough energy to keep the heater coil running. The temperature inside stayed comfortably above freezing. They sat in a loose circle around the converted power node, which now doubled as a heating unit. Yillex had taken to scribbling calculations on a salvaged whiteboard panel, trying to model the shelter's stress tolerances under different wind patterns. Feshna was reviewing field data collected during the storm, something about airborne salt concentrations and mineral dispersal. Wyatt leaned back, watching them work. "You two ever consider that this wasn't a failure?" Yillex looked up. "We were caught unprepared." "That's textbook failure." "No," Wyatt said. "You survived a storm that could shred metal, kept your equipment mostly intact, and adapted fast enough to avoid hypoxia, exposure, and structural collapse. That's a win." Feshna considered it. "We did panic, only for a minute." "Then you started thinking, that's what matters." Yillex scratched his chin. "Still, we had no contingency for shelter failure." "You do now," Wyatt said. "Write it down, build it into your protocols, then it's not a mistake, it's a field lesson." Feshna tapped her pad. We'll include the shelter design in our final report. Don't forget the tea, Wyatt said. Morale matters more than you think. The next morning, the comms panel crackled to life. Static gave way to a faint carrier tone, then a voice, clipped, formal, unmistakably Academy. Cadet team, this is Orbital Transport Echo 7, confirming visual on your beacon. Atmospheric interference delayed approach. Prepare for extraction in 2 hours. Yillex and Feshna both shot to their feet, speaking over each other. They found us, 2 hours, Wyatt raised a hand. Plenty of time. Pack your gear, grab your logs, and don't forget to shut down the turbine properly. No point leaving it to spin itself apart. They moved quickly. By the time the first glint of the shuttle appeared through the thinning clouds, the shelter had been disassembled into modular components, each labeled and sealed. Wyatt had even managed to patch his jacket with a strip of solar fabric where the wind had torn it. As the shuttle descended, Feshna turned to him. "You're not coming," he shook his head. "I've got another week out here, still need to survey the eastern ridge." Yillex gestured at the packed turbine mount. "You're leaving your shelter." "No," Wyatt said, tightening the last strap on the crate. "I'm taking it with me." The shuttle landed with a hiss of pressurized gas, the ramp lowering onto the sand. A uniformed pilot emerged, waving them aboard. Feshna hesitated at the ramp, then turned. "We logged your name in the report. Hope you spelled it right," Wyatt said. Yillex added, "They'll want to debrief you eventually. Your shelter design violates 7 procedural standards. Tell them to bring snacks." They boarded, and the hatch sealed behind them. Wyatt stood alone in the dissipating haze, the wind brushing against him in gentle gusts. He looked down at the packed shelter kit, then out toward the ridge where the dunes rose like frozen waves. 3 more survey points, he muttered, slinging the pack over his shoulder. "Then maybe I'll take a nap." He walked into the soft light of morning with a limp in his step and a stitched arm that itched like hell. But he walked steady, and the wind was calm.